Hey guys, it's me Trainman, and we're here in TRS 2006 for the Zombie Train Episode 1. And this is something I just decided to do, so whatever. Just wanted to give this little introduction and prompt you with the question which I thought of a second ago, and now I have no idea what it is. Oh! What kind of locomotive has a wheel arrangement 4-4-4? That's the question. It had to be either apocalypse related or train related, and I couldn't think of an apocalypse one off the top of my head. Also, keep in mind that the ending of this video is going to be recorded about 10 seconds after I cut this off, with the 50 minutes and 19 seconds of video in between. So, which is all going to be the story. If you guys were hoping for a regular episode of TRS this week, sorry about that. I couldn't, but well, I could have, but I had planned this for like 2 weeks, so you guys should have seen it coming. Alright, so hope you guys enjoy the end of days, and I'll see you guys at the end of the video. The End of Days by myself and Dad Coda. In 2012, on the winter solstice, it came. The end of days. The apocalypse. Nobody really knows where it came from, but by the time authorities identified what was believed to be Patient Zero at John Fitzgerald Kennedy International Airport in New York City, it had spread to dozens of cities around the country and across the world. When it made it out of the airports, it went to the households and hospitals. Then it broke free of those confines and spread like wildfire through the major metropolitan areas. I have to say that we were lucky. By the time it made it to Rhode Island, we knew it was coming. The state was nearly empty, and the military had abandoned their posts in Newport and Quonset, presumably on some order to lock down Manhattan, supposedly the most highly infected area on the eastern seaboard. Christmas proceeded as usual, except along with the traditional gifts, there was included an impromptu vacation. It was only the beginning of an elaborate plot between my family and the families of my friends. The plan that was worked on and thought about for days, weeks, months, and years past. It had been refined from the moment I really got to know my friends and understood the threat of this kind of attack. It is our zombie plan. Part 1. Through Worcester. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon when we entered the city limits of Scranton, Pennsylvania. Our convoy had been traveling, on highway and off, for 6 hours. This was my part of the plan. My father, mother, and stepmom had all agreed to this half a week in advance. My cousins had ratified my plan shortly thereafter. When we voted to leave at 10 a.m. on Christmas Day, the agreement had been unanimous. The 7 of us had piled into our 5 vehicles and began heading northwest. We traveled north on Route 146 for 40 minutes. The roadway was nearly empty, save for some abandoned cars. When word of the infection spread reached New England, people fled. Boston lost 70% of its population overnight, one reporter claimed. All of the stores began selling out, and Radio Shack was a popular place for about a day. I was able to pick up 5 sets of walkie-talkies, 10 in total, for under $25. I was surprised I had to pay with money at all. Currency quickly became meaningless. These handheld radios became the communication units between the cars in our convoy, and the beacons that would help us get in touch with our contacts and get them in touch with each other. I began flipping through the channels as my dad led the train of cars. We were in a Jeep Wrangler, pulling a trailer that had supplies, including an axe and various other weapons and tools, some extra canisters of gasoline, a generator, and electrical equipment, including a computer and a winch. The other vehicles, especially my cousin's Ford F-150, were also stocked with supplies. Notably, my mom's Volvo 940 had a bike rack, with 3 bikes, in case we were to run out of fuel. We were coming up on Worcester, Mass. It was a fairly empty city as well, but still had a large portion of its population alive. The city's center had turned into a fortress, with walls of sandbags and chain-link fence topped with a wooden boardwalk. I had seen it on the news. As we approached the city on Route 146, we found it full of stopped and empty cars, forcing us to backtrack to the nearest exit, We ended up on one of the main roads leading to the center of town. This is where we had our first contact with the undead. A sedan had lost control and crashed into an apartment building. 3 zombies milled around it. As we drove up, one broke off from the group and began to walk towards the Jeep. Without very much thought, it seemed, my dad turned slightly, hit the gas, and quite simply ran it over. There was a sickening crunch as the ghoul's ribcage slipped under the rear tire and shattered. The trailer bumped over its remains, and the rest of the convoy steered clear of the zombie's carcass. The 2 other zombies turned lazily and tried to follow us, but we sped up and drove away. From blocks down the road, we could see one of the now famous walls of Worcester. From inside the Jeep, we heard a megaphone, followed by gunshots. I took a glance in the mirror and saw that the 2 zombies that were trying to follow us had fallen face first in the street. Again, the megaphone echoed off the buildings, louder this time. "Are you a friendly convoy?" it called. "Respond or we will shoot. You are free to exit the vehicle and respond. Our snipers have the area covered." We slowed, but did not stop yet. As we passed the next intersection, I glimpsed catwalks between the buildings. In the upper windows, gun barrels poked out. All of the doors were barred and locked. "Stop now, or we will shoot," the voice said. My dad stopped the car as I gave the signal to the rest of the convoy. We stepped out, 3 blocks from the wall. Even at this distance, it was impressive. Television did not do it justice. "We come in peace," my dad yelled. "Are you in need of supplies?" "Somewhat. I noticed that your vehicle is very capable at destroying the undead. Perhaps we can help. I'd appreciate all the help you can give. Proceed to the wall." We stepped back into our vehicle and drove the 3 blocks to the walls of Worcester, to the wall of the Worcester compound, as they called it. From the entrance of the building to our left, the man with the megaphone stepped out. "Hello, I'm Gart Fowler," he said, hand extended. "I run the Worcester compound." My dad walked up and shook it. "Pleased to meet you, Mayor Fowler. I'm Frank Emelio, and this is my son Ellis." He gestured to me. "That's a good vehicle for the times." He paused to think. "It would be very useful. I'm sorry, but my Jeep is not for sale. I was suggesting you stay with us." My dad looked at me, then back to Gart. "We have a plan." "Ah, I understand. Then perhaps I may be able to provide some assistance." "I think we have enough fuel to make the journey." "That's not what I mean." He nodded to a man by the door. Moments later, a trio of people was hefting a large spiked plow out to the Jeep. In a crude fashion, they welded it to our vehicle. They gave us 1 more canister of fuel, wished us luck, and we backtracked, climbed onto Route 90, and proceeded west. Part 2. Albany Arms. The farther we went west, the more populated the cities were, both with the living and the undead. Vehicles, moving and stopped, covered the expressway. At one point, the road narrowed from cars stalled on the shoulders, barely wide enough for our convoy to slip through. Out of the lanes of cars came dozens of zombies. We gunned the engine and the plow was put to good use, tearing through the legions of ghouls. Most of them died instantly, and those that didn't were forcefully thrown aside. A select few became jammed against the plow, creating a warning sign. If their kind were able to feel fear, I expected it would be quite scary to the rest of them. We finally abandoned Route 90 in Albany, a thoroughly infested city. We decided it was in our best interest to skirt the city center instead of cutting through it, so we left the highway when we could and advanced into an empty suburban neighborhood. The winding back streets provided suitable refuge from the zombies, allowing us to make almost 9/10 of our journey through the city without encountering more than a dozen of them, all of which we promptly hit with the ram. Our journey continued unabated until we came upon the pigskin pimps. They were a biker gang, and when we first met, they were trying, unsuccessfully, to break into a sealed gun shop named Albany Arms. Their motorcycles were blocking the road, so we had no choice but to stop. Someone called out of the group towards us. "You mind giving us a hand with this?" We turned off the engine and stepped out as the group parted. Out stepped a man nearly 6 feet tall, with a beard that rivaled Father Christmas's. He looked like he had just stepped off the stage from performing with ZZ Top. "I'm Carson Daniels," he said, stretching out a calloused hand. "What can I do for you?" I clasped his palm and gave it a firm shake. I think it's more along the lines of, what can we do for you? I said. It seems so. He put his hands in his pockets. You've got a plow on that there vehicle that I think will go straight through that door. I agree. Maybe we can both benefit from this. Guns for everyone, you mean? Hell, we all need protection out of the dead horizon. If you can bust down that door, then we'll have a deal. My dad had already climbed into the Jeep and started it up. I walked around the back and detached the trailer, allowing him to maneuver more freely. He backed up, put it into second gear, and gunned it. He had more than enough momentum to splinter the bolted door, and shards of it became impaled on the ram. He reversed and led us into the shop. It was cramped inside, with barely room enough for 10 people. Fortunately, there were guns enough for dozens more. There was everything from simple hunting rifles, a wall of hunting rifles, to a small, thick glass case of assault weapons. In squads of 5 or so, all 19 of us filed in and out, taking as many guns and as much ammunition as we could carry. My cousin Chris even managed to snag a bolt-action sniper rifle. The pigskin pimps went for smaller firearms, like submachine guns and pistols, so we got most of the more powerful goodies. By the time the last group exited the shop, we had our own case of weaponry, with shotguns to carbines. In the cab of the Jeep, we kept an M4, silenced on single shot, as well as an 870 MCS. When we went to part ways, Carson again stepped out of the crowd. He leaned on the windowsill of the Jeep and spoke to me. I'll be damned if this doesn't pull us through, he said. If we ever meet on the road again, I'll have you know that I owe you one. He looked back at his men. We all owe you one. I'll be sure to take you up on that one of these days. With that, he gave us one more toothy grin, climbed back onto his motorcycle, and drove off, with the rest of the pigskin pimps in pursuit. All of our cars started up fine, and we abandoned the scene. Hopefully someone else would come stumbling along who could use the rest of the weapons in that shop. If not, it would fall to the undead. The entire transaction in the gun shop took less than 20 minutes, although it felt much longer. Even though the infested world seemed larger and more treacherous by the minute, I had a strange hunch that that wouldn't be the last I saw of Carson Daniels. We left that city within the hour, and I didn't get to shoot at a single thing once. Chris, however, with the sniper rifle hanging out of the rear of the truck, took down half a dozen of the ghouls since we passed them. He was a damn good shot, I had to admit. Part 3. The First Destination. There it is, I said into the walkie-talkie. My father and I had been here twice before, but everyone else in the convoy had either only been here once, or never been here at all. Scranton, Pennsylvania was growing in the windshield, home of Dunder Mifflin Paper Company, and more importantly, Steamtown. I had heard from my friend Nick that the volunteer staff had abandoned the place immediately, with the few paid employees leaving soon after. I bid him farewell over the web before he took the highways and left for Lake Erie. I hope to talk to him again, eventually, or even meet him in person. That is something I hadn't done before. Scranton was mediocre in terms of the undead, but we didn't have the option of skirting the city this time. We went in straight on the highways, the plow cutting the way. We even got ballsy and pushed a car, blocking the street, onto the sidewalk. The parking lot of Steamtown was surprisingly populated. It looked like there was a battle here, people trying to get into the mall on the other side of the tracks. There were a few basic handheld weapons on the ground. Sledgehammers, crowbars, and axes were littered along parked cars, some of which still had open doors and trunks. A few were still running, yet there were no corpses on the ground. Being deep in the winter, it was already getting dark. We couldn't wait the night out in the parking lot as much as we wanted to, so we parked in the fire lane and walked around to the roundhouse doors. They were all locked. In an effort not to disfigure the doors that would ultimately keep us alive through the night, we broke into the ticketing booth instead, a small wooden shack outside of the main set of buildings. We were lucky. The small booth not only held a meager amount of money in an unlocked safe, but it had the keys for every building on the premises. Silently, we walked from the admittance shack back to the museum doors. They unlocked with a soft click, and we stepped inside. Everything was off for the night. All the displays had been powered down and, at this point, left to sit for the rest of their operational lifetime. Then it occurred to me. I wasn't just here to save myself, my family, and my friends. I was here to save a piece of history from its cruel and drawn-out fate of being left to rot in a disintegrating roundhouse. There, on the other side of the turntable, was my true escape vehicle, Canadian National number 3254, a steam locomotive that was, up until now, under the protection of the Steamtown National Historic Site. I climbed up the observation deck and looked out across the rail yard. I began to take a tally of where things were and what they were, realizing that it was rather unfortunate how there was only one flat car, when we needed to put our cars and vehicles on. We needed several boxcars for supplies, coaches, hopper cars, tank cars, etc. I already knew where tons of extra fuel was, but that was all the way back in Providence. We'd have to get there first. Content with my observations, I walked back down the stairs. When I reached the first display room where we had set up shop, I sat down with the group to take inventory. While I'd been making an account of the railroad cars and their locations, the rest of my family was unloading our convoy. All told, we had almost everything we started with, plus a lot of guns. I wrote an extensive list of what we brought, so I knew what we were missing, and it was only a meager amount of food. We had brought a lot. Smartly, we brought no perishables. Only canned food, grains, jugs of water, just in case, and some seeds for various plants. There was a gondola car that I supposed we could just fill with dirt and have a mobile farm. We'd probably meet some farming communities on our travels anyways. I sat down to take a breather, and my cousin John sat next to me. "Why a train?" he asked. "Of all the ridiculous vehicles you could choose to survive in, why a steam train? And not, I don't know, a nuclear sub or something?" "Actually," I said, "Emelio wanted to get a nuclear sub. When I asked him where a working, unguarded one would be, he said he'd get back to me on that." John laughed. "I chose a steam engine from, naturally, an emotional standpoint, but I did consider some practical things. For one, it needed to be easy to refuel. All you need for a steam engine is anything burnable and water. I know where they park trains full of coal, and water is everywhere. Also, I had to have something where I could transport many people at once. Thirdly, it needed mobility. I know this needs rails, but there are rails everywhere, and they won't be choked with stalled cars like the highways were. Ideally, I'd have a Zeppelin, but this is a decent second. A Zeppelin? Yes. Mobility over land and water, high cargo capacity, ability to stay aloft for months at a time. I get it. Understand that? Yeah. Hey, your dad said I'd have to be shoveling coal. Was that your idea? There's actually something I never got to tell him. CN number 3254, the engine we're, borrowing, has an automatic stoker. Nobody needs to shovel. Ah. The rest of the night proceeded without incident. Every 2 hours, a new person was selected for watch. The only zombie that wandered to the door was quickly struck down with the hiss of a silenced G-17. At around 5 a.m., I decided that I had waited long enough. I walked quietly across the turntable and popped open the roundhouse doors. She was magnificent. I climbed to the cab and looked over the gauges and levers. I recognized most of them. There was the throttle, independent and train brake, reverser, pressure gauge, water gauges, air brake pressure, etc. I climbed up onto the tender and found that it was, luckily, full of coal. I didn't see a coaling tower nearby. The water was also full, as if the engine was prepped for an excursion the moment before the apocalypse began. That's when I noticed the checklist. Almost everything was checked off, then the whole sheet was X'd, and someone had scrawled, "Excursion cancelled." The only thing that wasn't done was the grease, but the grease pump was nearby and loaded. I snatched it up and walked around the locomotive, ejecting grease into the vital joints of the engine. There were tubs of this stuff nearby, and I noted it as something I had to take with me if this train was going to make more than one journey. I stepped back into the cab and opened up the firebox. It had been dumped at the end of the last session. It was clean of ash. Even though this engine had an automatic stoker, I found a shovel in the cab. On a table next to the locomotive, there was a box of newspaper, some small wooden kindling, and a box of matches. I carried all three up to the cab with me, one by one. Minutes later, I started a blaze. The firebox was heating up rather quickly. I took a shovelful of coal and tossed it in atop the burning planks. That quickly caught fire. In a few minutes, steam was building, and the dynamo that powered the engine's electrics was turning. As I started the stoker, it slowly spread the burning coal and added more fuel to the flames. As the pressure gauge climbed, I kept my eye on the water level, making sure to keep the water above the mark that the engineers had left in Sharpie. When the sun crested the horizon and my group began to wake up, I had a strong temptation to blow the whistle, but I restrained myself. The mall across the way was thoroughly infested. Before long, someone must have noticed that I was missing, and they filed out onto the turntable's edge. I took this time to step down from the locomotive's cab and dramatically open the roundhouse's tall glass doors. The group walked over to me, and I heard a muffled stream of wows. "This," I said dramatically, "is our ticket out of the apocalypse." I pulled the key off Steamtown's keychain labeled turntable and tossed it to my dad. "Line it up," I told him. He walked off towards the small booth that the turntable is controlled by and carefully lined the tracks of the turntable with the tracks of our one open stall. Now it was go time. I climbed back into the cab, followed closely by John. I stood on the right while he stood on the left, watching everything I did like his life depended on it. In fact, it might at some point. I clenched the reverser lever and pushed it as far forward as it would go. Then I released the independent brake, followed by the train brake. I watched the needles on the gauges shift. I carefully gripped the throttle and eased it forward. The locomotive rolled and released a heavy chuff. I pushed the throttle an inch more, trying to get a feel for the beast. We picked up a tiny bit of speed and emerged from the roundhouse stall. The tracks creaked as we moved onto the turntable, and I released the throttle, putting it back to 0. We coasted about halfway to the other side of the roundhouse, with most of the engine on the turntable. Worried about overheating, I checked the water level again, and disabled the stoker. I was quickly getting the feel for it. I gave the engine some more water, pushing the throttle forwards again. We rolled further onto the turntable, just barely getting the tender on before we stopped again. I gave the signal to my dad, and we started rotating towards the nearest track exit. When we had lined up, I put both sets of brakes, stepped out again, and began barking orders. When we were shunting, it would be loud, and easily noticed by many zombies. So being able to take them out before they took us out would be imperative. With that in mind, I stationed Stephanie, my stepmom, and my mom at entrances of the roundhouse, in case a ghoul tried to walk in here. I had my dad rotate the turntable to the more northerly out position and climb back into the cab. I stepped over to my side, released the brakes, and gave the throttle a hard jerk. The wheels slipped for a moment, then found purchase on the rails. This lane of track brought us straight through a fence, breaking it down. We would have upended a pump cart if we hadn't moved it off the tracks earlier. We weaved between a Lackawanna diesel unit and the big boy, on our way to the end of the yard. Last night I had spotted the string of 7 passenger cars that we were going to take. They were the excursion train, and were normally attached to the other end, towards Moscow, Pennsylvania. I had thought of this route, but when I traced the maps, and found it would inevitably lead to New York, I decided against it. This meant that the other side was blocked by a lone, rusted caboose. By the time we made it past the switch points at the end of the yard, the first of the undead were filtering out of the mall. Chris began picking them off from the 3rd-story balcony of the roundhouse. One shot taking down 3 or more. We unlocked each of the switches and threw them, allowing me to back to the caboose and couple with it. After some quick thoughts, I ended up pulling back out of the yard and moving it back towards the roundhouse. With that disconnected, I moved back out of the yard again and coupled to a prop freight train containing our one and only flat car as well as a usable caboose. I would most definitely take both of them, as well as the boxcar and gondola that were attached. Even still, it would require some organization. I first took off the caboose of that train and left it on the closest track to the mall. The next thing in the train would be the flat car, so I put the gondola off to the side, while my dad and stepmom removed the prop crates. I doubted I could fit more than one vehicle on the flat car, so I stopped the train and went looking for more. I noticed one way in the back, but was not willing to go get it. That's when I saw the 2 next to the passenger cars, covered in nondescript, rusted junk. In front of them were 2 decent-looking boxcars and an engine and a half. That is, 1 steam locomotive, number 1, with its tender, and another random tender behind that. Clearing off those flat cars could involve heavy lifting, so I told John to get out of the cab and help my dad, while I called my mom up the ladder. I very quickly went over the various gauges and valves on her side, then proceeded back into the dilapidated string of cars. I decided to take the whole thing, not leaving behind the rusty passenger car at the far end. I suppose that we could convert it to something useful at some point. A quick pull on the throttle gave the engine all the power it needed to break the solidified grease on the car's bearings. Screaming and complaining, they began to move. Then I got to organizing. It was a lot of back and forth before I had it how I wanted. Putting the passenger car to the side with the other 7, connecting the flat cars and putting them with our caboose, moving that poor engine number 1 and an extra tender out of the way, and putting the box cars with the other one, still attached to the reading locos. While I was doing that, Dad and John had successfully got all the junk off the flat cars, covered the splintering wood with tarpaulin, and built a makeshift ramp to load the Jeep and the truck onto our train. We also hauled the trailer and the pump cart up there, just because we had the extra room. I made a quick zombie check. The bodies of the again deceased undead had barricaded the mall door, but it wouldn't hold for long. I wondered how many of them were trapped in there, how many people let the doors shut on them, and had to hold out in stores until their inevitable demise. Chris was still watching vigilantly. I took the boxcars and added them to the train next, followed by the gondola car, which, of course, I hoped we could eventually fill with dirt and have a farm on the go. Unfortunately, the only tank car in the entire yard was buried in the rear of the second-to-last row of rusty rail cars. I figured we'd get it if we had time, but the zombies were already trying to climb out of the parking garage. Earlier, my dad had towed the coal hopper out of the roundhouse using the Jeep, and it was waiting for me to move into place. I backed down the station and coupled to it, planning to make my last operation of the day. We had almost everything we needed. While we moved all the supplies from our cars into the boxcars, I took a garden hose and began putting as much water as I could into the tender. I let it be to pick up a shotgun. The train yard was becoming infested. They even started coming out of the woods behind us. I received the OK signal, and Chris abandoned his sniper post to climb into the passenger cars, which I was just hitching up to, the hose being stretched around a rusty caboose, still dumping water into the tank. Stephanie turned the water off and jumped inside, while John and Dad were still securing the boxcar doors and finishing tying down the vehicles. When I finally put everything together, the undead were within a few yards of the cab. There, I found the second reason why I wanted an enclosed cab locomotive, the first being that it was noon and still below freezing. Only the constant movement of fighting and shunting had kept us warm. A snow started to fall as I tested the brake lines on the train. I climbed back into the cab, undead in hot pursuit. Without fair warning, I pushed hard on the throttle, and felt the old couplers snap together as the wheels of number 3254 begged for traction. With a confident smile, I hit the sander, just enough for us to gain momentum and carry us through a full stroke of the massive driving rods. The first of the undead began to climb into the cab, and I leaned out and filled one's face with lead. By now, we were moving, and nothing was going to stop us. The heavy noise of the pistons echoed through the Pennsylvania hills as we crossed over to the northbound track, well on our way to Binghamton, our next turning point. Even as a novice engineer, I had little trouble taking the train up the 1% grade past Clark's Summit. From there, it was mostly level and a bit downhill. This was a part of the world that no one on the train had ever seen before. The Tunkhannock Viaduct, which I had read about when planning the trip, was very impressive. In just under 2 hours' time, we reached the rail yard in Binghamton. A few zombies milled around, probably the remnants of the crew who once controlled the yard. They were kind enough to leave us an open path through the yard, and we didn't have to bother taking over the switch tower or even firing a single bullet. Thanks to the train, however, we did splatter a few of the ghouls. When we crossed the Susquehanna, the snow began to fall more heavily, but in the warm cab, we felt none of it. I was about to bring us back up to speed when I noticed the Y. I stopped and sent out my dad, John, and Stephanie to break the locks and throw the switches, while Chris kept watch with a sniper rifle from the caboose. Binghamton Center was overrun, so I had to use my shotgun several times to keep zombies from climbing up. When the most immediate switches were thrown, they jumped back on the train and we advanced across 3 sets of tracks and past some sort of quarry. The rest of the transit out of the town was actually rather difficult, with having to keep stopping every time we encountered a set of points. We finally broke free of Binghamton and began heading northwest. Snow contacted the speeding boiler and vaporized as we passed through Sydney and Unadilla, giving the train a steamy robe. We weaved back and forth over the Susquehanna River at a blistering 55 miles an hour. faster than we had ever gone in this locomotive, and probably faster than it had ever traveled in all of its years of service at Steamtown. We blew through Oneota, the minor snowstorm becoming an outright blizzard the farther we went east. Because I could barely see, I began to slow as I neared Dillonson, 3 hours later. There was a switch up ahead, one side pointing further northward towards Schenectady, while the other went almost due east towards a small town called Selkirk. There was a far more to Selkirk than just roads and houses, however. It contains a 70-track yard that can process over 3,200 cars per day. I assumed it would be long abandoned by now. I was wrong. To be fair, it was nearly devoid of life, save for 12 familiar men struggling to assemble a string of cars using a locomotive they had found the keys to. The path that the switchman left open led us around the yard, and I spotted, through the snow, the grid of 12 motorcycles parked on the dirt between two sets of tracks. And then we almost hit their train. I was slowing down anyway, straining to see if there were any particularly useful cars in this monster of a yard. I was able to hit the brakes in time for their single AC 6000 CW locomotive to slink back into the yard. There were 2 men in the cab, with 9 more clustered nearby. When I leaned out of my cab to ask what the hell they were doing here, one of them pointed at me, turned to his buddy, and said something. Their locomotive stopped, and out he came. Carson Daniels had found us again. The leader of the pigskin pimps walked over to the side of 3254, and I climbed down to shake his hand once more. "What are you doing here, man?" I asked. "Our escape route. We came here after Albany and have camped out ever since. We just now found the keys and got this here locomotive running." "You gonna pack up your motorcycles and go somewhere?" "Yeah, trying to get to Miami. Those big tank cars are full of fuel, I think. Should serve us fine." "What the hell are you driving?" "When we first met, I was on my way to Scranton. There's a National Historic Site there called Steamtown." "And that's where you found it?" "Absolutely. We have more than enough coal to make it to our next stopping point." As I said this, I noticed 3 loaded hoppers in the yard behind him. "But I think I'll take those." I pulled up the radio and asked my dad to disconnect our train at the hopper. "How are you throwing the switches?" I wondered aloud. He smiled deviously and pulled a walkie-talkie off of his leather belt, then glanced at one of the switches nearest us. He rattled off the code into the radio, and the switch threw moments later. That's when I noticed that the one man was missing. "You've got a man in the switch tower, don't you?" "Yes, we do." "Nice job. Hey, I could use that favor right about now." "Which would be?" "I need a tanker full of water, and those cars of coal right there." I pointed behind him. "Can do," he said. "Move your train past those points." I climbed back into the cab, and after about 10 minutes of back and forth through the yard, we had acquired 2 tank cars full of water, 1 of gasoline, and 3 cars of coal, which John and Chris were shoveling from the cars to the tender. "What are your plans for this behemoth?" he yelled to me. "Going down to RI to pick up some friends," I called back. "Then what?" "Not really sure. I'd be happy to lend a hand." "Why Miami?" "I heard on the news they're blowing out the bridge to the Keys in a week. I want to be out on those islands. Heard zombies can't swim." "The news?" "Yeah. People may not have broadcasting stations anymore, but they still post to YouTube. They've documented us once, when we first arrived here. Then they took off. I don't think we'll be seeing them again unless they saw you roll in." "We're hard to miss," I said, "but you can miss a lot in this storm." After a bit of debate, we decided that we would be parting ways here. A trip to Miami was simply not in the plan for our ancient locomotive, and it'd be better if they had their own train. We helped them hook up a dozen boxcars and load their cycles before we climbed back into the cab and left, giving them some extra charts that I didn't need. I warned them not to go through New York, but I doubted they would listen. They were as hard-headed as the rest of us. 3 hours later, after blowing through Pittsfield, we arrived in the outskirts of Springfield, Mass. We had to throw a single switch in Westfield, but other than that it was smooth sailing. The wind had died down, but the snow was still falling heavily. In Palmer, on the other side of Springfield, we stopped again to throw a switch. This time, we weren't alone. About a dozen zombies clustered around our train, and by the time we killed them all off, the next set of visitors had shown up. They were in a white van belonging to some Massachusetts news organization that I'd never heard of. According to the reporter, they'd been following our train since Chatham, but had no way of signaling us to stop for an interview. After a brief overview of who we were and what we were doing, they let us go. They, however, could not. Our gunshots had attracted a horde of undead from Springfield, and they had waited until now to make their way over the Connecticut River to here. The news people's van would not start, and we couldn't hold out for long, so we stuffed as much of their equipment as we could into the rusted passenger car and pulled them aboard before I pushed the throttle hard and we sped off into the storm. I was looking over the maps for our car trajectory when I noticed our next major city, Worcester. I was honestly looking forward to meeting Mayor Fowler again. When we pulled into town at 2.5 hours later, I was exhausted. I had been working with the locomotive since 5 a.m., piloting it continuously since noon, and it was nearly 10:30. When I stuck my head out of the cab and heard that megaphone, I breathed a sigh of relief to know that the Worcester compound was still going strong. My dad stood atop the passenger cars as I slowed to a halt, and over the wind and the noise of the locomotive, identified himself. When Gart realized who we were, he quickly opened the thick wooden gates he had put over the tracks, and we were ushered inside. We spent the night there without ever leaving the train. We all huddled in one passenger car with the wood stove cooking and slept. When I woke up at 7 the following morning, December 27th, I stepped outside to see what the compound was really like, and I found it to be pretty damn impressive. The walls went multiple blocks in all directions, with catwalks strung between buildings and secondary barricades built on the streets. We were guests here, and when Gart saw me stumble out of the passenger car into the harsh daylight of the morning, he came down from the wall and over to me. Overnight, the snow had piled into drifts, and I wondered how we could get out of here. The Y that I needed to orient ourselves was on the other side of the wall behind us. The caboose would surely derail if I tried to back through the snow. I had a little chat with Mayor Fowler about my trek and my motives. As I did that, the rest of my crew slowly woke up. We walked to the wall that we had came through, and I was informed that it was built on the edge of Southbridge Street, and it curved slightly down Quinsigamond Ave. He said that he already had people shoveling off the tracks and roads just outside of the walls, and they would expand as the hours passed. There was 1.5 feet of snow on the Y that we needed to use, and we'd be informed when it would be safe to traverse. I had to admit, Gart had a lot of manpower at his fingertips. By 8:30, I had the engine greased, cold, watered, and a fire burning hot. Half an hour later, we were backing out of the thick wooden gates and down the Y. The two newscasters left us to stay there, but hoped to meet us again. They said they'd have our story on the web within an hour. We pulled around the Y, and I gave one last wave to the people of Worcester as we pulled off into the forest. The sun shone on that day, and by the time noon rolled around, we had rolled through Woonsocket and eased over the ancient tracks in Central Falls. We had to cruise along a rusted set of tracks beside the pristine Amtrak rail for several miles before we had a chance to cross over, and it was in the yard south of Pawtucket. From here, we were able to end up with 5 full coal cars from a string of over 30, not to mention transfer to the concrete-tied tracks of the Northeast Corridor. The moment the caboose crossed those rails, I opened the throttle wide and began pulling slowly on the reverser, decreasing the stroke and allowing the wheels to spin more freely. We hit a top speed of 70 miles an hour as we blew through West Warwick, and then I began to slow us down. The heavy engine clunked onto the ancient rails of the Quonset Naval Base. We drove cautiously down the side of Roger Williams Way, and that's when I saw him. Almost a dozen people were waiting for us, one of them being my good friend Emelio. Part 4. The rest of the plan. The day we left, I gave the rest of the group their orders. They were simple. Carry out your parts of the plan. My friend Ian's was really that simple. I told him to survive and have his dad relay to me any important information he could. By the time I got to Steamtown, I knew that the Northeast Corridor was clear and that there was a long string of coal cars left near Pawtucket. Another one of my friends, Emelio, had a somewhat more complex plan. His preparation had started alongside mine. He formulated half of the plan. After I left, he started packing. All the supplies he would need for up to 3 days were stuffed into his mom's SUV. Unfortunately, his parents had their own plans, somewhat set in stone. They almost wouldn't let him go. But by noon on Christmas Day, he was on the highway going southward, towards Quonset and its naval base. The post had been abandoned at least a day before, its production line stopped, its barracks emptied. But it was still a naval base, complete with weaponry and tools made to supply the U.S. military. It was our consensus that these supplies could help us as well, if they did still exist. The freeway, even as it passed through the empty forest, was as constricted as any other, with many cars left on the side of the road. The undead, however, were few. About halfway there was a sign of life. A vehicle had pulled over, and a man was sitting outside with a folding table out front. Emelio slowed to a halt, and saw that the table was covered in guns. On the front was a sign that read, "Will trade weapons for gasoline." As Emelio was seeking guns, he stopped the car entirely and stepped out. He had extra containers of gas, and this man seemed desperate. Before he reached the table, the man stood up, aimed, and put a silenced bullet through the head of a zombie milling around on the other side of the highway. "Do you have gasoline?" the man asked. "I do." "How much?" Emelio shrugged. "A few gallons. How much do you need?" "That should be enough to get me to the next gas station." He paused. "Take 2. Actually, take 3. I can probably give you 50 rounds for whatever gun you want." "Where's this all from?" "Little shop in Cranston. Used to run it. I just had to get the hell out of there. Guess I forgot that I needed to tank up. By the time I realized it, I got stuck out here." "Am I the first person to stop?" "Yep." Emelio looked over the guns and spotted exactly what he wanted. "Where the hell did you get this?" He pulled a Carl Gustav recoilless rifle out from under the table. "I'm not sure. I found it in the back room when I was leaving. I have 2 cases of shells, too. About 2 dozen in total." "Want it?" "Hell yeah, I want it." "Take it," he said, waving his hand. "What else do you want?" Emelio picked an M14 and an M9 from the table and looked at the man inquisitively. The man nodded and produced a box of ammunition. Emelio walked back to his car and took out his cans of gasoline, showed that he had enough in his tank to get him to his destination, and knowing that there would most likely be a supply of it coming with his rescue. He stowed his weapons and climbed back into the SUV, waving a goodbye to the man as he drove off. Half an hour later, he made it to the Quonset naval base, becoming happier and happier with his spoils. He jimmied the locks on one of the smaller buildings and stepped inside, content to make this his base of operations for the next couple of days, until I arrived. The base was completely empty. The stories were true. The military did abandon this place to make a futile attempt on New York. He assumed it was the same for Newport. He felt around for a light switch on the wall. When he found it and flipped it, he was happy to see that this corner of the world still had power. After securing the building and putting his stuff inside, he decided to venture around the compound. Without breaking any locks, he couldn't do much. The complex was shut down tight. He returned to his building as the sun set and slept the night away. The next day, he was determined to make more of an impact on his stores. The first building he broke into was a garage and contained a Humvee that was out of gas. He looked over the mounted turret and wondered if he could substitute that machine gun for his Carl Gustav, or even take off the mount and put it on something else. There wasn't time for that, however. He had no idea when I would get there and what kind of trouble I'd be bringing with me, so he had to be ready with weaponry. One of the barracks was easy to get into, but it was no armory, just 2 M16A3s and a single M1911. These would be good spoils for most everyone else, but they were nothing to him. He scavenged for another 2 hours, finding an MG36, 3 M4A1s, 5 G17Cs, and a single M98B sniper rifle, all with very limited ammunition. When he returned to his home building to stow what he had gathered, he saw the first of the other survivors arrive. A black Land Rover drove up, license plate Bedard, and out stepped a man who introduced himself as Paul, saying he was directed to come here by Ellis. There was a protocol about this, so Emelio asked him the code word, to which Paul replied, "Zombie train." This was correct, so Emelio led him into his survival shack, as he liked to call it, and helped him unload his car. He gave a satisfying wow when he saw the pile of weapons in the corner, and Emelio explained that those guns were for the supply and protection of the zombie train. They went out to scavenge for more weapons. With twice the manpower, they were able to find a bit more, including a pair of 870 MCS shotguns with buckshot and slugs. There was also a singular grenade launcher with 5 regular shots and 3 smoke grenades. When they returned for lunch, there was another vehicle waiting for them, with another Paul, my uncle, his wife Marie, and their daughter Jenny. They also knew the code word. When introductions were done, they ate, waited a bit, and finally set up the laptop to keep tabs on the rest of the world. There was only one thing that related to me, and that was an interview with this group of bikers that called themselves the Pigskin Pimps. They were at a rail yard in Selkirk, south of Albany. Emelio recognized it as the place that I was going to pass on my way. It was put up on the web at around noon that day, an hour and a half earlier. They kept watch over the web to see if there'd be any shred of information about Steamtown or number 3254. The snow began to fall minutes later and didn't stop. Emelio shut the door and didn't expect to see anyone else arrive in this storm. He was wrong. Nearly an hour later, there was a knock at the door. Emelio, being a good person, answered it. It was Ian and his parents, my contacts. They brought with them both their dog and all of my animals, 2 dogs and 2 nice evil cats. They shut the door again and cranked the heat, listening to the howling of the blizzard outside. Emelio awoke at 9 a.m. on the morning of the 27th. It was his 3rd day here. The snow had stopped, but when he forced the door open, he found that there was nearly a foot of fluffy snow on the ground. Luckily, there was a snow shovel in the survival shack, which he used to clear a path out to the cars. He nearly tripped over the 2 steel ribbons of track. When everything was clear, he decided that there was one last building to bust into, a warehouse. And it was a treasure trove. There were tools like cutting and welding torches and full crates of weapons and ammunition. There was a wooden box of P90s and a smaller box of M1 Garands. Very pleased with himself, Emelio walked back to the survival shack, where the 7 people he had left were all wide awake and glued to the computer screen, where there was a video of a snowstorm. Through the middle of it cut an eerie glowing shape, number 3254. The film was taken by a Massachusetts news crew the day before, and as the video proceeded, Emelio watched the locomotive chug through the Massachusetts backcountry, creating a steamy wake. A female newscaster narrated the scene. Here on the tracks between Chatham and Springfield, we see a relic of the past, surviving the zombie apocalypse. No doubt a last-ditch effort to save this piece of history. When the camera zoomed in, he could see 2 ghostly figures inside the cab. Someone behind the camera exclaimed, and the van screeched to a halt. The whole of the survival shack saw the train fly by. The engine, followed by 3 hoppers, a tank car, 8 passenger cars, one of them rusted and orange, a gondola car, another tank car, 4 box cars, a 3rd tank car, 3 flat cars with vehicles on them, and a caboose. 2 of the passenger cars glowed with light, and he swore he spotted a silhouette or 2 in the windows. Just like that, the train was gone. But that wasn't it. The video faded out, but it wasn't over. The woman that he assumed was behind the camera earlier was suddenly standing in a dirt parking lot with the engine behind them. To her right, Ellis stood. She interviewed each of the people on the train, but never managed to state where they were. "I hope they get here soon," Ian's father said. There was a pause, and then he turned his head slightly and said, "Do you hear that?" "Hear what?" someone asked. But then my Uncle Paul started hearing it too, a steady pounding that grew louder by the second. Emelio dared to stick his head out and saw the plume of smoke. He ushered the group to the door, and they pulled themselves out of chairs, off the desks, and off the floor to look out at the approaching locomotive, which was plowing straight through the snow with ease. It rolled to a halt about a dozen yards from the survival shack, and out I stepped from the cab. Part 5. The World to Travel. "We need to load up your stuff and get going," I said. "We've got a lifetime of travel ahead of us." Everyone climbed out of the little building and onto our train, quickly loading all of their weaponry, food, and tools into the boxcars and passenger cars. We doubled our personnel count that day, but still lacked a decent engineer. With the extra time we had, Emelio detached the turret from the Humvee and mounted it on the caboose. When we left Quonset, we had added a gondola car, a boxcar, and an SUV to our train, as well as 8 people, 3 dogs, and 2 cats. We tripled our weapon count and got another sniper. It had been cloudy from the moment we arrived in Rhode Island, but now the clouds parted and the sun shone. There were many days ahead, anywhere from 5 to 20 years of undead nightmare, according to Mel Brooks' Zombie Survival Guide. If we made it, it would not be an end, but a new beginning. I could imagine the day would be steaming over the old bridges to conquer Manhattan, something the might of the U.S. military could not do. I expected to find many more people on my journey, on our journey. The story from here on out was the responsibility of our group, and I hoped that we would all live to see the day that this war would be over. But there were more immediate concerns. We spent that night in a siding to the south, and filled our water stores and our farming car the following day. It was a week into the apocalypse, and the few surviving towns were walled and shut tight. New Haven was one of these towns, and it was our next stop. As number 3254 approached the metal gates of New Haven, Connecticut, they opened. Apparently, we had reached some sort of fame that only internet news can provide. There, we ran into some old friends from school, escaping the end of days in a convoy of retired military vehicles. It was great to see them again, and we spent 2 days there, catching up for the week of time that we spent apart. We very nearly convinced Jason to go with us, but we went our separate ways after all. If we picked up more flat cars, we'd be more help, but until then, it was just us. We gained 3 people in New Haven before heading north, towards our next, undefined destination. To be continued. Hey, so I hope you enjoyed that little short story I wrote. It's 21 pages. I'll send it to you if you want it. It's a little bit different. I know I screwed up quite a few words, but I just kind of kept going because I screwed up enough. I had to redo some paragraphs like 3 times because what was it? The one that had, what did it say? Oh, crossed over onto the when I'm talking about crossing over onto the concrete tied tracks of the Northeast Corridor, I got so tongue-tied over there. I had to do it 3 times before I got it right. But yeah, so remember to post in the comments the answer to the question, which was, what is a locomotive with a wheel arrangement 444 called? And yeah, so that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and Trainman out. I'll see you guys after the world ends on Sunday.